So this is another review video I'm going to do. I suppose a review or a reaction, if you want to call it a reaction, it's more a review to a video that was done talking about the relationship between neurochemical models of DMT, ketamine and various other drugs, and how it relates to the near-death phenomena and out-of-body phenomena. So someone linked it to me to ask me to have a look and give my thoughts. So this is what I'm doing. The video is called "What Does It Feel Like to Die? Neuroscience May Have an Answer" by Arvin. So go over, have a look at his channel. 479,000 subscribers, doing very well indeed. So I can only assume that his content must be very, very good indeed. So let's take a look, and I'll give you my thoughts.
Imagine for a moment that you can hear noises and people all around you, but when you try to respond, nothing happens. Your arms and legs don't respond. Your muscles refuse to contract when you tell them to. You're conscious, but you can't open your eyes. Sounds come in through strange filters, distorted and warped, as if they've been run through synthesizers, and none of them seem to be connected or related to each other. It's like you're dreaming, yet not. You're aware, but not fully conscious. So finally you give up and find that the moment you do, you are at peace. You drift through comforting, familiar scenes of forests, exploring caves, and interacting with nature and animals. What happened? Well, you've just been in a medically induced coma. Claire Wineland experienced these sensations in 2015 when she was literally put on ice.
Or in a lucid dream.
After she contracted an infection called blood sepsis, following a routine surgery for cystic fibrosis. For an entire week, she lived in a dream world, immersed in a wilderness of memories, dream imagery, and distorted sensory input from the outside world. And then she came back to tell the tale. She even made YouTube videos about her experiences. She died in 2018 due to complications from surgery, but not before sharing her near-death experiences and the transformative change it had on her. Not that I want to experience this anytime soon, but one of the things I've tried to imagine is what it may have been like for her. What will it be like when I die? And I don't mean the afterlife, or heaven, or the other place, or anything like that. I mean the actual feelings, emotions, visions, and sounds that I would experience just before I left this universe.
Very important question, probably one of the biggest questions in humanity, so I'm glad that he's addressing it.
I would be surprised if you haven't thought about this too. I imagine that it may be something like what Claire experienced. What does science have to say about this? Can experiments and other evidence give us a clue about a process that we know is coming for each and every one of us?
Yes, and it's been done. Probably the best person that I've seen to look at the phenomena of death and deathbed visions and the experience of death is probably with Dr. Peter Fenwick of the Galileo Commission. He's done a lot of research over his many years of his life, and certainly one to look at. That's Peter Fenwick.
Could learning about it alleviate some of our fears about death and dying, which is probably mostly due to the unknown? What if we could make it a little more known?
That's the thing about death that people fear, is the unknown. A lot of people may fear the pain that's associated with dying of some dreadful illness, but generally I think the main thing that frightens people, at least frightens me, is the uncertainty of what's to come and what the experience will be after physical death.
Join me as we figure out what this may be like. Coming up right now.
Arvin. I must remember Arvin.
If you want to view a more extensive treatment of human consciousness, check out a documentary called Mind and Consciousness, available at Magellan TV, today's sponsor. It dives into the human brain and examines how the awareness of ourselves could arise from the connections of billions of neurons and how this plays
How it arises from the connection of billions of neurons is firstly making the presupposition that it must do that. I think the better question is, to begin with, if the brain creates consciousness as a result of the billions of neurons. So the human brain is one of the most complex structures known, with over 100 billion neurons constantly sharing information. How does that add up to consciousness? So again, I'll change the question. First of all, does that add up to consciousness? And then if we find the answer to be yes, we then go deeper and say, well, how does that work? As of yet, there's absolutely no mechanism understood as to how physical matter, i.e. The brain, even with its incredible amount of complexity and billions of neurons, there's no mechanism as to how that can generate conscious experience. It's assumed that it must, although there is little to no evidence to suggest it, at least to directly suggest that it creates consciousness. All we have is neural correlates.
Into the debate about science and religion. Magellan is a new kind of streaming documentary service created. Claire's story sounds remarkably similar to others who've had near-death experiences. Some commonalities include out-of-body experiences, positive emotions, celestial landscapes, and meeting deceased persons. They describe floating above their bodies.
I haven't heard very much about celestial landscapes, maybe in quite a few, I'd imagine, because that's going to be kind of an expectation. Whenever you hear about being out of body, people usually describe floating around the universe and seeing the Earth. And so any near-death experiences that include that, I'd say, are probably down to the expectation of what they'd experience.
Spending time in beautiful places, meeting lost loved ones, feelings of euphoria. Why should the collective experiences of so many people sound so similar?
You could make arguments from both sides there. You could say that it's similar from if you want to say spiritual or non-physical perspective, you'd say because we're all kind of consciousness is the same for everybody, and so of course everybody would experience the same thing once they leave the body in the filtration system of the body. From a religious point of view, you could say, well, heaven's going to be the same for everybody if you get to heaven, that is. And from a materialistic standpoint, you could say, well, human brains, although we're all unique, are basically the same at their fundamental level, so we would expect the brain to do the same things at death, and so everybody would experience something very, very similar as a result of that.
Are people's consciousness really leaving their bodies as they're dying, or is this all a hallucination happening inside the brain? Well, most people who've had this experience don't describe it as hallucinations, but as real-life experiences.
So there was comparisons done on hallucination versus near-death phenomena and out-of-body phenomena, and it was concluded by the researchers that that essentially these experiences can't be described as hallucinatory because the phenomenology between near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and hallucination experiences are totally different. Hallucinations are generally in very confused states, very random things, very chaotic environments. And one person I remember, when they were talking about the comparison, they gave the example of someone who was in a confused state and hallucinated a lot of little black shadow creatures, men kind of running around on the ceiling and running around, preventing them from getting to a phone to call for help. I think it was when they overdosed on a suicide attempt. But there are, hallucinations usually are frightening and very confusing for the person and very unclear, whereas near-death phenomena and out-of-body phenomena are often hyper-lucid, more real than this reality, I suppose, from the experiencer's point of view. Completely lucid, completely aware, effectively living just as we are now, and as I say, even more so. There's no sense of anything being unreal. Most people, when they wake up from a hallucination, can look back and think, yeah, it seemed maybe real at the time and scary, but now that I look back, it was definitely a hallucination. I can definitely tell that now. So many weird things are happening. With near-death phenomena, that doesn't happen. They come back and they say, nope, this was absolutely real. I remember it just like it was yesterday, even though it was 50 years ago. And the memory never changes and never gets distorted over time.
To test the idea of people leaving their bodies and floating above it, researchers placed images on high shelves in hospital rooms, which were not visible unless you were on a ladder close to the ceiling. They then interviewed hundreds of cardiac arrest survivors who had been revived in those rooms, but none reported seeing the images.
Maybe a slight unintentional misrepresentation of the data there from what I'm aware of. I might be wrong, but from what I'm aware of the study, it is true that they did kind of ask hundreds of people who survived. However, out of those 100 people, I believe it was only one person, or maybe I think it was 3 people, had out-of-body experiences that included veridical perception. Out of those 3, only one person was well enough to be interviewed about it. So from the size of the 260 people that took part in the study, unwillingly because they were dead, or they had cardiac arrest, of all those people, only one person was well enough to be interviewed who also had a possible veridical perception. And when he was interviewed, or she, I think it was a man. When he was interviewed, he did see things that were verified later on by the doctors and that took place during the time when his brain was definitely not functioning a certain amount of time after his brain had stopped, if I remember correctly. We know that after the heart stops, effectively the cortex, the neocortex, the part of us that effectively makes us human, is registering flat on an EEG after 30 seconds since the heart stopped. And what he perceived, I believe, took place during that time, don't quote me, but it was certainly during a time when he shouldn't have been able to see or hear anything, and he correctly identified a doctor and correctly identified what he said, I believe. And although he didn't see the target, which rendered the experiment a failure, he did have critical perception during a time when he shouldn't have done so, although that's often overlooked because the target wasn't seen. The other study was Sampania's Aware 1 study. He's doing Aware 2, but we don't know the result of that yet. The other person that experimented with this was Penny Sartori, and she mentioned that although nobody saw the targets, when she interviewed people afterwards, they said, well, no, I was out of my body. I thought I was dead. I wasn't looking around for targets. If you'd have told me there was a target there, I'd go and see it. I would have gone and seen it and told you what it was. But I didn't know it was there. I wasn't looking for it. I think that's quite a valid point. If you found yourself out of your body all of a sudden because of a heart attack, a sudden heart attack or a sudden stroke or something, you wouldn't be looking around for things to remember. You'd be panicking, thinking you're dead. There is one case that Dr. Gary Habermas told me about, of a lady who had an impulse to remember long numbers all through her life, and when she came out of body, she saw a serial number, which I think was on the back of a machine or on the underneath, anyway, somewhere that she wouldn't have been able to see it from where her body was. It was a 12-digit serial number that she remembered exactly, and when she came back, she said to the nurse who was looking after her, she said, I've written down this number that I remembered when I came out of my body. Go and have a look. It's on the back of the machine or the bottom of the machine. And it was accurate. I mean, that's just an anecdote. However, I believe it is confirmed. I think Dr. Habermas said it was a confirmed one. I've never heard of it, and I haven't really looked at it further. But that's an example of the sort of critical perception. Although it may not occur for the targets that were placed, it did still occur in the Aware 1 study by Sampania.
One clue about what might be happening is that these out-of-body experiences sound similar to the journeys people have described while taking psychedelic drugs, like psilocybin, LSD, or DMT, in which people also describe traveling to otherworldly realms.
There was a study done by, I think it was Charlotte Martial and Dr. Bruce Grayson of the University of Virginia Department of Perceptual Studies, and it was called Neurochemical Models of the Near-Death Experience or something like that, where they compared the language used to describe a experience on a psychoactive drug and on a near-death experience, and compared the language used, and they found that ketamine, I think it was ketamine, was the highest, was the closest experience to the near-death experience, and DMT and others, and psilocybin, as he mentioned, was very close as well. The thing is, with dimethyltryptamine trips and ketamine trips, although they are very, very similar in many areas, they're ultimately very different experiences as a whole. So, but you'll probably talk more about this later on, so I'll leave the rest for then. But essentially, although they are very similar experiences, there are key differences between them which separate the near-death phenomena from any other kind of drug experience. The only thing I think is that maybe if you have a cocktail of these drugs at the time of death, you could kind of substitute experiences that one drug doesn't do with another, depending on how the brain may release these chemicals at death. But we'll carry on.
Encountering godlike beings and discovering a greater reality beyond their everyday experiences. Could there be a connection? A 2015 study by neuroscientist Dieguez and his co-authors concluded that the disembodied experiences is due to disturbances on a part of the brain called the temporal-parietal cortex, an area that some of these drugs can affect.
Sorry, I want to hear that again.
Everyday experiences. Could there be a connection? A 2015 study by neuroscientist Dieguez and his co-authors concluded that the disembodied experiences is due to
I thought he said that the encounters with disembodied spirits
disturbances on a part of the brain called the temporal-parietal cortex, an area that some of these drugs can affect. This is a part of the brain that gives us a sense of self and perception of our body. If damaged or stimulated, it can create an out-of-body experience.
No, it can't. Not, by the way, it depends on how we define the out-of-body experience. To me, an out-of-body experience is when someone comes out of their body fully and can, look around, see what's going on, and potentially bring back critical information about something that they saw. For me, it's better when it's somewhere that the body wouldn't be able to see it naturally, so maybe in the next door or even down the street. But the temporal parietal junction, when it's stimulated by a probe, which was done by Dr. Olaf Blank and his compadres, I believe. Is that the right word, compadre? Doesn't matter. What they found was that stimulating this part of the body created not the out-of-body experience, but the sensation of the body rising or of the body separating. I remember reading that one lady that he stimulated her TPJ, temporal parietal junction, mentioned that she felt her leg rising up, or felt that suddenly she was sitting up, or suddenly she was sitting lying back down when it was stopped. I can't remember if she said that she saw herself from outside of her body, which is also known as autoscopy. I can't remember, but essentially the phenomenology of the TPJ stimulation induced out-of-body experience or out-of-body sensation is totally different to the traditional out-of-body experience in the spiritual or non-material scientific form that it takes. So say, although we know that these sensations may be linked to the TPJ, again, this is only correlatory, so we can't immediately say that it's causational. It may very well be, but we can't say it is. For example of that, the analogy I use is I've got a piano that whenever you press a key, say the C key, a little LCD display comes up and says C, so it tells you what note you're playing. So that's a correlation between hearing the C note and seeing that light up, and it does that every time, so it's very tightly correlated. To say that immediately that means causation would mean to say that that lit up C on the LCD display is causing the sound. So that's kind of why we can't immediately jump to causation by saying the TPJ, when it's interfered with, causes these experiences. It may be causal, it may just be tightly correlated in a different way.
Researchers propose that a network of brain activities can account for the mechanism of out-of-body sensations and even mystical experiences.
It can't. I'll tell you why. It certainly can't account for a mechanism, because we don't have a mechanism as to how non-conscious matter can create a conscious experience to begin with. The Hard Problem of Consciousness by David Chalmers. No matter how strong the correlation may be, we're still going to get stuck on that wall of how does brain matter, when it's connected in a hyper-connected, hyper-complex way. And effectively the brain is a system of on and off switches, action potential or non-action potential of neurons. How does that create what people call qualia, or experience, effectively, the sensation of I am? And effectively, neurons are very, very small bits of matter arranged in a very complex way to create even one neuron, billions of them together, which communicate via neurotransmitters, which by themselves are unconscious matter, just unconscious elements in a certain configuration, and an electric charge, which is, again, unconscious matter, atoms transferring electrons from one atom to another. That's effectively what an electric current is. So how can all that, which is fundamentally non-conscious, create any form of conscious experience? That's the big problem. That's the hard problem. So we certainly would not be able to find a mechanism without first finding the mechanism of how consciousness can arise.
According to a study done in the mid-90s by Rick Strassman, a professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico,
DMT, the spirit molecule.
That people had near-death and mystical experiences following injection of NN-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. DMT is a powerful psychedelic. Found that people had near-death and mystical experiences following injection of NN-dimethyltryptamine.
Not strictly true. They didn't have near-death experiences. They had maybe near-death-like experiences. But as I've said previously, the ultimate phenomenology between the near-death experience and a DMT trip are different, although they share very similar components. I was talking to a guy called Pascal, who's a very smart guy. He's doing his PhD at the moment in this very subject, dimethyltryptamine, in relation to near-death phenomena. And as he rightly said, as I've just said, the phenomenology is slightly different. Although it's very, very closely related, there are aspects that cannot be explained by dimethyltryptamine drips. But as I said again even earlier, perhaps we could substitute another drug which may also take place in the brain at death, say ketamine, which may fill in the blanks that DMT can't provide. Although I believe when he'll probably go on and talk about the DMT produced by the pineal gland, there's more to talk about there, but we'll leave that until he mentions it.
Or DMT. DMT is a powerful psychedelic drug that is also known as the spirit molecule. Strassman's studies showed that more than half the people injected with this drug had religious experiences, typically interacting with non-human beings in a disembodied state.
Yes,
Strassman says that at near death, the body produces natural DMT in the pineal gland. This could be another reason that people can have out-of-body experiences near death. On the other hand...
Okay, so this is a little bit of a myth that dimethyltryptamine is produced in the pineal gland. It may well be, but it's never been shown to do so in humans. It's been shown to do so in rats to a reasonable level. However, it hasn't ever been shown that the human pineal gland produces DMT, or B, that it produces it, if it does produce it, that it produces it in significant amounts, sufficient enough to create a hallucinogenic experience. We don't know if it does or if it doesn't.
Could some of these experiences be due to natural processes in a dying brain? Researchers have found that when the brain is dying, the body releases endorphins. These are the natural feel-good drugs that the body produces typically in times of intense physical pain or suffering. The body does this naturally to suppress pain. Long-distance runners have described this as a runner's high. Researchers theorize that when someone is dying, it is these endorphins that produce a sensation of peacefulness and contentment.
But again, we're left with the question of how do those feelings arise in the first place? Could it be that the chemicals themselves are producing the feeling by messing with the brain, or could it be that that they're kind of acting as a pathway for a natural experience to come from a non-physical source? I mean, we don't know. We're completely assuming at this point. However, neither position to me is more supported than the other, because there is no mechanism for both theories. Now, we don't understand. We have no idea how the brain can create consciousness, nor do we have any idea how consciousness could be a separate thing. So, I mean, most people will say it's silly to believe that the brain doesn't produce consciousness, but the evidence that's used to back it up can also equally be used to back up an idea that consciousness is transmitted to the brain and that the brain receives it and filters it, neither of which have an ultimate mechanism as to how it could happen. So, no, believing that the brain creates consciousness is no more superior a theory to the brain receives it from an unconscious, or from a non-local consciousness. There's no mechanism for either.
Not unlike what the people who've undergone near-death experiences report. It's known that too much carbon dioxide in a dying brain can affect your vision, making it feel like you're in a tunnel. In addition, it's also known that a lack of oxygen can cause...
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, the feeling of being in a tunnel isn't exactly what people describe in near-death experiences. They describe being in a tunnel, not having the sensation of being in a tunnel, but actually being in a tunnel. They see a three-dimensional tunnel. It's not always a tunnel, but usually it is. So again, very different to simply the sensation of being in a tunnel. Another hypothesis brought forward, I believe, by Susan Blackmore, or at least she's pushed the idea, is that as the brain dies, the retinas, I think it was the retinas of the brain of the eye begin to degrade from the outside in, which create tunnel vision. Which, if you've ever had tunnel vision, it's effectively your vision starts to fade in from the outside, so you're only left with a pinprick of sight. However, again, that experience is very fundamentally different to what's described in near-death experiences. In near-death experiences, they don't describe at all anything that can be said to be tunnel vision. They describe standing in a physical tunnel, or a physical-like tunnel, but often more real than real. Another important point on the CO2 and oxygen was that an experiment or a study done by Dr. Bruce Grayson and others, I think Sampani did one as well, don't quote me on that, showed no correlation between the levels of gas in the blood, i.e. carbon dioxide and oxygen, and the frequency and depth of near-death experiences. So essentially there was no link found between high CO2, low CO2 and near-death experiences.
Hallucinations. Combine this with the rush of endorphins triggering a sense of contentment and peace, and this combination may explain much of what people seem to experience. But the data is incomplete because even people who weren't liking oxygen have described visions of being in heaven.
So if we assume that that study that shows no correlation between blood gases and near-death experiences was wrong, let's take it on the grain of salt that it is, which it may be, but I would doubt it. Yes, we could say that a mixture of all those components could create the subjective experience of near-death phenomena. And I've often said, if near-death phenomena was simply the subjective experience of going out of body, going through the tunnel, seeing deceased loved ones, seeing heaven, and then coming back, or then waking back up, I'd have no problem saying that that was hallucination and the death process of the brain. The problem is when you add third-party verified veridical perception, then you have an objective measurable phenomena that does take place and has been confirmed to take place in their thousands. Fewer have been reported where the brain was measurably not functioning, or at least we know that the brain wasn't functioning, not because we measured it, but because we know what happens after, say, cardiac arrest. After 30 seconds, the brain EEG is flat. So although, say, an individual patient may not be strapped to an EEG at the time, we know that the perceptions that they reported were of events that took place at least 30 seconds or more after their heart had stopped. So we can very, very reasonably induce by inductive reasoning that their brain was not functioning at the time. And that's the near-death experience that I like. That's the one that adds evidential value, because I agree, subjective alone near-death experiences don't offer much in terms of evidential value. Near-death experiences with third-party verified and often verified by professionals, verified perception, do add that extra level of empirical measurement.
If certain drugs induce similar sensations, is it evidence that all this is happening in our brains? Some scientists argue that these scientific explanations don't explain the full range of experiences that people have, so we should not conclude that all out-of-body experiences have a scientific explanation. But is this what it's like?
I agree, but I wouldn't say a scientific explanation that we can't conclude they have a scientific. I'd say we can't conclude that they have a materialistic scientific conclusion. When we understand it, what's going on, even if it turns out not to be physical in nature and it turns out to be some form of non-local consciousness, that will still be a scientific discovery using scientific methods, but it would need an expansion of science as we currently know it to step away from the materialistic dogma, I suppose, or paradigm that we currently have. So yes, it will be scientific, but it will be an expanded science, which includes non-local, non-material, possibly phenomena.
To die for everyone? Perhaps not. The precise experience may depend on how you die. If you die abruptly by some sort of severe accident, then it could be just lights out with no such sensations at all. A 2016 paper by Allison Yao describes sudden cardiac arrest as a shutdown across all bodily systems. The heart stops pumping, the lungs stop breathing, and electrical activity in the brain also drops to zero, indicating no neuronal activity. But what if you've got a little more time than that? Say you're trapped in the bottom of an ocean.
But we can't say that because of that we would expect lights out, sudden lights out due to sudden cardiac arrest. We'd have to collect cases of people that have had this and ask them what they experienced before concluding that must be the case. And I don't know if that's been done, but I do know that people who have had accidents, say a car accident, as was illustrated on the video there, people have had these car accidents where they've been suddenly, sudden death, I suppose. Can't confirm that they were certainly dead in terms of the heart or the brain wasn't functioning, but certainly sudden periods like that, sudden cardiac arrests as well, where they have had experiences out of body. And then we get to the question of, does non-experience entail non-experience, or does it entail experience that wasn't saved in memory? That's one that we won't be able to really cross, because how would you tell?
And your air tank has run out. What happens in this kind of scenario? A 2006 paper by Peter Lindholm shows that hypoxia, or lack of oxygen in the brain, usually quickly renders a person unconscious when the pressure of oxygen in the blood drops to around 25 to 30 millimeters of mercury. Normal pressure is around 100. Around the same time you suffer cardiac arrest, your heart stops beating. Death in this case may be much like falling asleep. In a 2015 article in The Independent,
I think drowning or asphyxiating is often experienced as a very euphoric experience. It starts off being incredibly unpleasant, but when you get to a certain threshold, it becomes very, very nice, very calm, very euphoric. I still wouldn't want it to happen, but apparently it wouldn't. Hasn't been described often as going to sleep. It's more described as, let's just say, feeling incredibly euphoric. And those that have experiences usually don't experience. Well, I spoke to David Bennett recently, who said he did experience just as if going under general anesthesia. So I suppose he didn't experience it, but he had a blackout of experience before waking up in this out-of-body state. He didn't say it was like going to sleep.
One near-death survivor
but then everybody's different.
Describes his experience as taking a nap, a short nap with no dream. You wake up and it feels like you've been sleeping a long time, when in reality, it's only been about 15 minutes. Few of us want to die suddenly. We want to die in a comfortable bed, surrounded by our loved ones. This is called...
I think I'd rather go quickly. Just a shot to the head when I'm not expecting it.
Called active dying.
Assuming that bullet actually kills me, I don't want to be... Can you imagine that, having to be shot in the head and not dying?
What is that experience like? James Hallenbeck, who has extensive clinical experience with many dying patients, writes this in Palliative Care Perspectives, which is a guide for palliative care for physicians. People tend to lose their senses and desires in a certain order. First, hunger, and then thirst are lost, he says. Speech is lost next, followed by vision. The last senses to go are usually hearing and touch. Could this mean that people can still hear us and feel our touch even though we think they're gone? Neuroscientist Adrian Owen thinks so. In a 2017 article in The Guardian, he describes using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to enable people in vegetative states to communicate with loved ones by...
However, vegetative state isn't essentially death, because the brain is still active. It's still showing a reading on the EEG, which would allow for this sort of perception to take place.
Thinking of certain types of scenes to indicate yes, and other kinds of places to indicate no, which appeared to work in the cases that he studied. In a state of active dying, we say our goodbyes, breathe our last breath, but then what? Could it be that we are still aware, even though we may look like we've passed away? For a couple of minutes after your cerebral cortex stops working, your pons, thalamus, hippocampus, amygdala, and medulla oblongata may sing to one another a swan song of a dying consciousness. Jimo Barisian, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan.
Is the thalamus not part of the cerebral cortex? I'm not saying it's not, I'm saying I don't know. But I don't know, if the cerebral cortex is down and gone, effectively it's all higher function. As far as we know, all higher function stops, and it's just the more primitive part of the brainstem that survives. If we say after the heart stops, it takes maybe 15 to 30 seconds for the neocortex, or the cerebral... Maybe I'm confusing the neocortex and the cerebral cortex. Regardless, it takes the neocortex about 15 seconds after the heart stopped to go flat, 15 to 30 seconds. After that, it's up to 3 minutes, I believe, for the brainstem to go completely flat as well, so you're totally brain dead. Brainstem is the very primitive part of the brain that only accounts for autonomous kind of functions like heartbeat, breathing, and reflexes, things like that. There's no higher cognition involved with the brainstem as far as we know.
Described the neuroscience behind this phenomenon in a 2013 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Barisian and her research team anesthetized rats and stopped their hearts. Suddenly, all the different regions of the brain became synchronized. The rat's brain showed higher power and different frequency waves, and also what is known as coherence, the electrical activity from different parts of the brain working together. Barisian's team found that In the moments just before death, rodents' brains experience a surge of neuronal activity in the gamma band range, along with theta wave activity, which is associated with working memory retrieval. These may be the neural correlates of seeing your life flashing before your eyes. One last performance of the all-time greatest hits of your existence here on Earth.
So, yes, this study was done in rats. Was it the University of Minnesota or something like that? I can't remember. And it showed that, yes, there was this surge of brain activity in rats at the time of death. Again, we don't know if that takes place in humans also. I don't think it's ever been shown to occur. And this could also be, used an explanation as to how DMT is released in the brain. But again, we can only say in rodents, and we can't say, A, does it take place in humans, and B, does it take place in enough quantity to enable these kind of hallucinogenic experiences. In terms of the life flashing before one's eyes, what's often experienced in near-death phenomena is what's known as the life review. I've seen far more of those than I have of people who just have their life kind of flash before their eyes as they're about to die. It does take place. And it seems to also coincide with a time dilation, if that's the right word. Time seems to slow down to enable those memories to take place, or the memories and mind speeds up significantly. But in life reviews, what's often experienced is not simply seeing scenes of the life go past, but actually taking part in them again, from your point of view and from the point of view of others who may have been affected by your actions. So say you bully someone at school and you remember, and you go back and you go into the life review of you bullying that person. Not only will you experience the feelings that you had of bullying that person, you'll also take the point of view of the bullied person and how they reacted to it, and anybody else that was involved and how they reacted to it. So it's kind of this immersive panoramic life review. I'm not sure how that would be explained by these correlations of consciousness and of brain waves in rats, but I suppose we have to keep open to that kind of thing.
A lot of cardiac arrest survivors describe that during their unconscious period, they have this amazing experience in their brain, Parisian says. They see lights, and they describe the experience as more real than real life.
In which case it's not an unconscious period. If it was an unconscious period, it wouldn't be experienced. So the question is during these experiences, effectively, the key thing is, what's the brain doing? How long after the heart stopped? Was there any what's the word? Was there any chest compressions taking place which could have allowed blood and oxygen to flow to the brain at the time, which would possibly allow for experience to take place? If not, then the brain would have been flat after 15 to 30 seconds, and therefore, how was this able to take place?
The sudden release of neurochemicals might explain this feeling. So where does this leave us? What is it really like to die? By most accounts, the experience does not appear to be an unpleasant one. The brain appears to do everything it can to help ease any pain and suffering you may have, and provide comforting stimuli to your senses. One way of looking at death could be that it's simply the inevitable end of a physical process.
That's not really one way to look at it. That's the truth. That's what death is, or at least our definition of death. It's the end of our biological existence, I suppose, where all our biological systems shut down and the physical matter that makes up our body degenerates.
Like the silence after the last notes of a song, or the end of an irreversible chemical reaction. As far as neuroscience can tell, there's no way for the brain to support consciousness for a long period after it dies.
There's also no mechanism as to how the brain can produce consciousness to begin with. But yes, no, that's true. There is no mechanism that shows how consciousness could exist after the brain is not functioning. However, the phenomena from near-death experiences, especially those with veridical perception, which have taken place in times where we knew the brain should not have been functioning, seems to suggest that it can. Does that suggest that there's eternal life after physical death? Does it entail that there's even life after physical death for hours at a time? Maybe not, and it doesn't do that. But what it does suggest is that consciousness can exist regardless of the brain being in a state where it should not neuroscientifically support it.
More than your internet browser could keep running after you shut down your computer. But what if consciousness doesn't run on the brain, the same way that the websites you view on your browser don't run on your computer.
And I personally think the evidence for that is much more parsimonious than the evidence for the brain producing consciousness. And the reason I say that is because every piece of evidence that I've seen used to show that the brain creates consciousness can also be applied to the idea that the brain receives or filters consciousness, or that ultimately consciousness is separate from the brain but interacts with it. And I believe that that theory also explains some of the phenomena that we currently see that cannot be explained by the latter. So therefore I think brain-mind separation may be a much more parsimonious explanation than materialism. Whether that's the most parsimonious, there are ideas like idealism, which I'm not 100% familiar with, but that seem very, very parsimonious also. So it's just comparing worldviews. I think materialism is perfect for day-to-day life, but when it comes to consciousness and matters of extreme consciousness, it's always going to hit that wall of the hard problem, and I think it's a lot less parsimonious than the alternatives.
What if that song continues to play out somehow, somewhere else, like a radio station continues to play a song, even if your radio is turned off? There is no scientific proof of this, but it remains a comforting
and again, to just illustrate the other side, there's also no scientific proof that the brain creates consciousness. That's just a supposition.
For many, necessary idea. And sometimes, especially in times that are this stressful,
but he is right.
Maybe we just need to be comforted by possibility.
It's not a case of what's comfortable, it's a case of what the evidence seems to show. And although, yes, it might be comforting that consciousness may not end at death, regardless of whether it's comforting or not, if that's what the evidence suggests, that's what the evidence suggests, and that's what I believe the evidence suggests the most strongly. So it's not a question exactly of what's comfortable, but more of what's suggested, what's the most likely.
Then jarred by hard scientific evidence. And then again, maybe there's one more possibility.
And again, just to add there, jarred by hard scientific evidence, there is hard scientific evidence to suggest that the mind may not be in a causal correlation to consciousness, to brain.
Perhaps at the end of everything, you may find that dying is like reaching the end of a beautiful dream, but just not waking up. Or if it comforts you, not waking up in your bed.
Or if the evidence suggests it.
But waking up at the radio station. I'd like to thank my generous supporters on Patreon. If you like my videos, consider joining them. I will see you in the next video, my friend.
Okay, that was a very good summary of the neurochemical, neuroscientific position on out-of-body experiences and near-death phenomena. So I think that was a fantastic video. Well done, Arvin. You know, I can see why you've got a lot of subscribers. Go over to his channel, have a look, subscribe to him, and certainly support him on Patreon if you like the kind of things he covers, because it certainly is a fantastic overview of the mainstream scientific position. So thanks everybody for watching this quick review. I hope maybe you learned something from my ramblings. As I say, go over and have a look at Arvin Ash's other content on other subjects. I'm sure it's incredibly enlightening and certainly worth your time. If you like the content, subscribe of course to his channel and do support him on Patreon. Any videos or any articles or anything you'd like my thoughts on, just send them to me. You can email me at darren@seeking-i.com. You'll find my contact details all over the place. Send me a link to a video or a link to an article. Let me know you want to hear my thoughts on it, and I'll make one of these on that. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.